Hi guys, I'm back. Sorry about that little break. All right, I guess it wasn't a break for you. Just hit another play on another video. So cultural determinism. So here's the awkward example from the 1700s, 1800s, and that is race is associated with level of development. And there was this sort of theory at the time called the Great Chain of Being, that essentially God created, everything in this great chain of being, and so there's God at the top, and then down, 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 down. And part of this is racial. So here's the Europeans, and here's the other races down here, and so it's not a surprise that the Europeans are developed and the rest of them are underdeveloped, and it's a racial thing. Ugh, messy and gross. And there's really no proof of that. There's no not proof. Proof's not the word. Evidence of that. Sort of another way to take this, which also kind of devolves into a racial theory very quickly, but to sort of focus on the culture. And so, for example, Latin America has a non-materialistic culture. It's not as sort of wrapped up in sort of capitalist materialism as, say, Europe was. And so a non-materialistic culture equals a poor work ethic, low innovation, and a lack of development. A little better, but again, you can see how that turns into racism really fast as well. And honestly, culturally, there just isn't been really a culture around the world that doesn't fit very well into development. So here's what we end up with all these sort of structural theories, is there's just not a lot of great evidence for deterministic theories. Probably the best you're going to get is on that last page, where you have lack of resources leads to nothing to develop. But even that's not a perfect thing. It turns out that agency theories are much better, because human beings don't just sit in bad environments and then just sort of stay poor. That's just not how human beings sort of work. So we're going to switch to agency theories. And again, these are the theories that are essentially where human beings go in and change the structure, rather than structure changes how human beings interact. One of these is what we call mercantilism. And the simple version of this is, it looks like this. If I did a map of the world, and I went back and looked in sort of the days of colonialism and imperialism, and I put a map of all the colonizers and colonized in the world, that would line up with level of development pretty well. And again, that's not a big surprise. If, say, a country like, let's say Britain goes into India and then takes a whole bunch of resources out of India through imperialism, and then at some point later on, India gets its independence and it's free, well, Britain's already taken a whole bunch of stuff out of India. So not only has India fallen behind developmentally, but Britain's pulled further ahead on sort of the resources of India. So it's not a big surprise that, say, the 20th century, 21st century, if you were a colonizer, you're more likely a developed country. If you were colonized, you're more likely to be underdeveloped. And there's actually pretty good, there's more evidence of this than there was of the structural theories. So then how do you fix this then? If I have an underdeveloped country, then what do I do to help it to become developed if this theory is correct? What are the solutions? Well, probably the obvious solution is you can't rewrite history. You can't go back and unring the bell. So are we stuck like this then? Are we stuck where Africa will tend to have underdeveloped countries and Europe will tend to have developed countries, and that's just all there is to it? Even if we want things to be different, we're just stuck there. You can't rewrite history, but that doesn't mean things can't be done. One option, for example, would be reparations. Should the countries, the colonizing countries, should they give money or other resources or expertise or help or whatever? Are they obligated to do that, to give that to the countries they stole the resources from? Is there a responsibility for the developed countries, particularly the colonizers, to help develop the colonized? These are possible things. And then we can ask the question of, even though it sounds like it's right, is this a valid theory? So for example, one of the arguments that, for example, Britain's going to give, if you say this to Britain, Britain will come back and say, hold on. Yeah, we took some of your stuff, but think of all the stuff we left there. We built railroads, we brought you democracy, we did this, we did that. So didn't the colonizer help the colonized? I mean, we gave you all these things. How have you not developed yet? Well, that's a messy argument. I'm not going to get into that right now, but that's definitely part of the sort of, is that true? Did the colonized get stuff out of that relationship? Another argument, sort of argument against this being a valid theory, are the colonizers still to blame? Like, India has been free since the 1940s. It's been independent. And again, what a critic might say is, if India can't get their stuff together over the next 70 years, then come on, really? And India, you could argue, has developed pretty well. What about Bangladesh? What about Burma? What about Namibia? Like, is the colonizer still to blame even after all this time? And then, of course, another argument would be that this assumes there's only one way to develop. And maybe there are multiple ways for a country to develop. Okay, one more slide. So we have mercantilism here as a potential set of theories. It's related to colonizer and colonized and level of development. Another one that follows this is what we call dependency theory. Dependency theory is just this, it's the same as mercantilism. Everything you saw on that last slide, it totally agrees with. But it takes the next step further and says, dependency continues after decolonization. So even after the colonizer-colonizing relationship is over, it's still there, is essentially what it's saying. So you can't just sort of, again, this is going to sound really awful, but imagine sort of a kidnapping situation where one person kidnaps another person. And then one day, 10 years later, that person lets the person go, lets the kidnapped person go. So now the question becomes, does that person who's been kidnapped, can they just start fresh? Or are they going to have a lot of baggage from that old relationship? And the answer is there's going to be a lot of baggage from it. The dependency still continues even after decolonization. That's going to be sort of this critical argument of that. In some versions, the rich countries intentionally keep the poor countries dependent. We're starting to drift into a little bit of Marxism here. Don't let that throw you off. It's not communism per se. It's just sort of this Marxist idea. So then what would the solutions be? If this is true, if the rich countries are keeping the poor countries dependent, whether intentionally or unintentionally, what can the underdeveloped countries do? One solution is to just get out of the global capitalist system altogether, just break away. Venezuela, for example, has tried this. Cuba has tried this, where it's essentially said, look, the whole system's rigged against us, so we're just going to get out of the system. Sounds great in theory, but it's a real difficult thing to pull off, as Venezuela and Cuba have shown. Another problem here is China and India are developing and part of the global capitalist system. So, in other words, if this dependency theory was true, then we would be shocked to find China and India doing okay, but they actually, they're doing all right, and they're part of the global capitalist system. So maybe there's no validity to this whole thing at all. The point that I want to make here is that there's a bunch of these theories out there about why one country develops and another country does not develop. And it's a real tough thing to demonstrate. There's no theory that we just walk away and say, that's a good theory, except for the one we're going to talk about next. So you're going to watch some videos on this, and then you were going to talk about the I can't even think of what it is now. Sorry. The neoclassical theory. But this next theory that you're going to see is the theory that is dominant around the world. It's dominant in the United States, dominant in Europe. In fact, almost to the point that people don't even question it anymore. So take a look at this and try to watch those videos and see what are they saying is how Vietnam and some of these other countries, how they were able to move from being underdeveloped to at least developing, if not developed.